Good morning. How are you all doing? Thank you so much for coming, and for those who are viewing online. My name is Duwain Pinder. I'm an associate partner at McKinsey & Company, where I focus on education, primarily higher education, on topics of strategy and operations. And I also help to lead a new institution that McKinsey founded called the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility, which is focused on topics of race and equity globally. So looking forward to the conversation. Why don't I pass to my panelists just for quick introductions, and then I'll set the context for the conversation, which should be a pretty dynamic one, and looking forward to diving in with you all. So, Dr. Branch.
Good morning. My name is Enobong Anna Branch, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Equity at Rutgers University and a professor of sociology. Happy to be with you.
Good morning. I'm Shaun Harper. I am a provost professor in the Rossier School of Education and the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California. I'm also the founder and executive director of the USC Race and Equity Center.
Good morning to everyone. Welcome to San Diego. Francisco Rodriguez. I serve as chancellor of the Los Angeles Community College District, and we are a system of 9 accredited colleges in LA.
Terrific. So maybe I'll just set the context for the conversation. I think the past year, year and a half, especially given the pandemic and in the United States, the racial reckoning that has come post the murder of George Floyd, I think has had many institutions reflecting on what their role is, primarily on equity. And this is not exclusive to higher education. Higher education has been really wrestling with these topics, both in and outside of their campuses. And so what we really want to do today is talk about what is the role of higher education in accelerating equity, not just nationally or globally, but also locally within their communities which they operate. So maybe I'll just set the context, and this is coming from an upcoming report that McKinsey is going to release on racial equity in higher education. But I serve many colleges and universities, and when the topic of racial and ethnic equity comes up in particular, people will talk about admissions and the reflective, and how do we make the student body more reflective, and that's really important, but higher education institutions play a significant role, not just in admissions. And our perspective is that institutions play a role on educators, not just the admissions, but also on the student life and support, the campus activities. Also the curriculum that they're teaching their students is a really critical component and one of the levers to pull in terms of equity. Also a huge role in terms of idea generators. Colleges and universities create significant research and scholarship that changes the way that fields operate. And so how do you think about that as a lever to expand and accelerate equity? And the final piece is on community institutions. Significant presence in local communities. Oftentimes colleges and universities are the largest employers in their local community. And so if you think about the role as a community institution, how can higher education institutions accelerate equity through that role in particular? And so I think that's the frame to think about higher education and equity, not just how do we make our student bodies more reflective, which is important, but how do we use the full weight and breadth of colleges and universities to accelerate equity. I think the challenge is we're not really making that much progress. We did some analysis and said, if you just looked at the reflectiveness, not just on the student side, but also on the faculty side, many universities are not at parity. If you take just the for-profit sector, which is doing great in terms of access, not great in terms of outcomes, it would take 45 years for that sector to reach parity. For 2-year institutions, 239 years. For 4-year institutions, 500 years. And for the largest institutions, the R1, R2 institutions that are generating a lot of the research and scholarship, at the current pace, they will never reach parity. And all told, it would take 400 years, about 370 years, for the entire higher education sector to reach parity on the student side and the faculty side. And this is not, Dr. Branch, this is not having a student population that is 100% Latinx or 100% Black. It's just to reach parity in the census population, just to make it reflect the weight and breadth of the United States. I think the second part is, if you just think about colleges and universities as employers, we're not really reflecting the full weight and breadth of the diversity of the population in the way that we hire, in the way that we reflect, the occupations. Many of the Black folks, Latinx folks, Native American folks, Indigenous folks who are on college campuses as staff are in service roles. They're the janitors, they're the food service workers, they are the landscapers. If you look at management is more likely to be Asian, much more likely to be white. And so it kind of just reflects the occupational segregation that we see in the broader economy, but also in colleges and universities. So a lot of growth to be made in terms of just the reflective nature of the staff that colleges and universities have. And the final piece is when we look at outcomes. So, there's trying to make the student population more reflective, not just on underrepresented minorities, but also on low-income students. But how do you also make sure you're serving those students? How do you make sure that those students are graduating and completing? So when we did the analysis, we looked at, four-year institutions, and we said, how many of those institutions are growing in terms of representation on underrepresented minorities, growing in terms of their representation of Pell-eligible students, improving on the completion rates of those two populations of underrepresented minorities and Pell-eligible, only 16%. And then when we said, okay, let's actually say who's actually making meaningful progress, right, it's only 4%. Right, so you see colleges and universities that may be improving on underrepresented minorities, not improving on completion rates. May be improving on access to low-income students, not improving on their completion rates to those students. May be improving on underrepresented minority completions and underrepresented minority representation, but aren't becoming more accessible. So how do we as a sector move simultaneously across all of those things? That is the question to be wrestled with. So that's just to set a little bit of a sobering context in terms of where the higher education sector is. As we started this, a lot of potential, but not enough progress. And so, maybe with that, I'd love to just, start the conversation with you, Dr. Branch. One of the things that I've seen in colleges and universities is people will say, let's have some initiatives and let's think about this in a present forward mindset. So let's have a new initiative or a new topic and not reflect on the past. And what we know is that higher education institutions have a significant, sometimes troubling past. And you've done a lot of research, not just on higher education institutions, but about the past in general. So I'm just interested in how you think about this topic of equity and how higher education institutions can wrestle with the past.
Thanks so much for the question and the invitation. And part of where I want to start with is going back to that slide. Can you go back to that slide around the number of years it would take for us to reach parity? The reason this is so important is connected to the question you've asked, which is, how do we understand the struggle of higher education is connected to the founding of higher education, right? Higher education was never intended to serve everyone. Just wasn't. When higher ed was founded, I was not in mind, okay? It was for the sons, not daughters, of the white landed elite. That was the purpose of higher education. So it's not a surprise, right? And this is the challenge of our forward-only mindset. What we're doing is retrofitting a system that was not built for equity, right? And so when we understand that that's actually the job, then it's not how many popsicle sticks and duct tape can we put together, but what will it take for us to actually retrofit a system to engineer equity? Right? That's the question, and that's why that historical context matters so much. We are just a generation and a half from when widespread access to college became available, right? So the notion of first generation, Pell eligible, the language that we talk about in terms of success and completion, we weren't even talking about that. And so now we still have our faculty, our structures that have a set of assumptions about who's walking in the door, that have not been updated in any way to reflect who is in the door, what they bring, and to value that. So this work of retrofitting the system is about both our structures and our people.
before I move on, Dr. Harper, Dr. Rodriguez, anything you want to add to that?
No. Other than amen, right?
And I was just going to add I'm not a mathematician, but how many years is never? And I think, when I saw the slide for the first time, shocked, dismayed, upset. As a practitioner for 36 years now, thinking that we might have made some progress at some point, this is, I think you used the word sobering. So I would hope that we would use today's discussion and conversation and ensuing conversations as really as a call to action and to underscore a sense of urgency at all of our institutions. I work at the 2-year segment where it is the most egalitarian, clearly the most racially, ethnically diverse, income diverse from all the higher education sectors, but still we fail in representing the student body as we should. One of the statistics that I will just end with this is that we may want to look at your capture rate of the individuals who are in your community, in your service area. What is the per 1,000 number of students who are coming from those communities to your institutions? And I bet you will find out, as we did, that we are leaving out scores, institutional and generational neglect of individuals who live across the street from your institutions, who tend to be darker in skin, older, lower income, et cetera. So that's one of the statistics that I'm going to challenge us with, to say, how are we serving our community? How do they show up at our institutions?
I mean, Dr.
Yeah, actually, I will jump in on this one quickly.
Yep.
So I will say that I talk about this every day. And I am trying to get us to broaden the conversation about reparations. I am not at all opposed to giving direct payments to Black and Indigenous folks who deserve those, right? But I also want us to think about the reparation of historical negligence, violence, and harm in the system, right? And how might we equitably invest in the populations that have been left behind for generations. That is one way to accelerate equity.
Yeah, indeed. Dr. Rodriguez, I'm just interested in your perspective on this, and definitely the other panelists. I mean, focusing on the student experience. The student experience, as we talked about, is not just the diversity, but also the curriculum, the teaching of that, the faculty diversity, the student activities. I'm just interested, can you comment on where are there opportunities to accelerate equity, particularly when it comes to higher education's role of serving and educating students?
Thank you. Was that to me?
Yeah, it was.
Yes, okay, thank you. Well, higher education, either we are an accelerator or a decelerator of equity. There's no in between. And if we're not doing the work to accelerate or be an accelerant to have better outcomes to and through our institutions, then we are actually doing something before. Without serious conversations of power, privilege, programs, processes, without those kinds of serious and honest conversations, we run the risk of further bifurcating and further exacerbating the kinds of results that Duwain just showed here. So that's the first thing that I want to say. The student experience at LACCD, like so many community colleges, first, I would say focus in on climate. What is the climate institutions? My partner here, he's an institutional neighbor, he's a colleague, he's a friend, literally down the street. But some cases, not in our programs, we might as well be thousands of miles away. So we try to find those points of intersection on collaborating on grants and collaborating on the student experience. For us, LA College Promise, every student, 2 years tuition-free education in California. We ran that legislation. Every Californian, rural, urban, et cetera. That has proven to be an accelerant for us. Remediation. We only have now one course below college level English and math. Before we had a whole cottage industry where students were trapped in remediation purgatory. Now, one level below, we redirected all those resources, and now the throughputs in college level English and math are much higher. Figure that. Our students can learn if they're put in appropriate learning environments. We're also going after adults. Lots of adults in our area have a little bit of education, but don't have a degree. A little bit of education, but don't have a certificate. Going after adult learners who are eager, particularly now with the pandemic and whatnot, because we are dealing with the dual pandemic of not just the global health crisis, but long-standing racism, the original pandemic. Absolutely. So because of those interests, we're going after those who have been displaced, dislocated, unemployed. Those who have been able to navigate the pandemic are insured, employed, housed, and educated, like us in this room. Inconvenient for sure, but we navigated it.
Absolutely.
Those who have been unable to fully navigate the environment that we're in with the dual pandemics, those who are unhoused, less educated, underemployed, and indeed uninsured. Well, guess what? 95% of the students that we serve are in that latter category. So it is a moral as well as institutional imperative for us to think about the end-to-end student experience through remediation. And then the last thing I'd mention that has been a real accelerant for us, in addition to being part of the community college leadership, the Equity Leadership Alliance with my partner here, where we have research that informs campus climate, is the whole idea of curriculum. Curriculum is the lifeblood of the institution. Mm-hmm. It remains after all of us leave. So we're infusing ethnic studies, the study of Black, Brown, API, indigenous communities into our curriculum and hiring full-time tenured faculty to do just that. Curriculum matters.
Yeah, I want to pick up on two terms that Francisco very brilliantly dropped here, right? Adult learners and remediation. Yes. But I want to talk about them in a slightly different prism, right? The way that I think about remediation and the way that we at the USC Race and Equity Center are working on remediation is that we are working to remediate racial illiteracy among adults who work at colleges and universities. Through our USC Equity Institutes and our racial equity leadership academies and so on, we are teaching faculty members, staff members, and administrators things they never learned anywhere else in their educational or professional upbringing around how to solve racial problems, how to talk about race in productive ways, how to decolonize a curriculum and integrate racial topics meaningfully across the curriculum. So it really does require developing a curriculum, honestly, for employees of colleges and universities. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we will succumb to some version of magical thinking, that equity for students will just magically occur because we declare it so. No, we have to upskill the adults who work at these places to actually achieve the equity that we're seeking.
So one more thing I'd love to add here, which is building on my brilliant colleagues. If we talk about what COVID-19 taught us, it's actually how illiterate most of our administrators were. And it's what I mean by that, not to offend my colleagues, but in reflection, everyone can see it. Most of our administration and our faculty did not fully appreciate the students who were in front of them. We saw them, but we didn't fully appreciate, and the range of challenges that COVID-19 forced academia across all sectors to confront. The choice in front of us in terms of whether we accelerate equity or not is if we choose to forget. So all of the things that we have deemed necessary to operate, and then if the question becomes, well, we just want to go back to like normal operations, the struggle was just hidden in the normality, right? It wasn't absent, it was just hidden. And kind of our desire for that false normalcy is connected to the dynamics of the student experience we didn't see or choose to see. And so that attention to the holistic student experience, basics like internet access, computer technology, all those things that we know determine whether you're successful or not, that holistic attention is key for how higher ed accelerates equity.
Yeah. And you can apply that, Dr. Branch, that holistic attention to the topic of research and scholarship. You know, as I reflect, many of the ideas and practices that people are doing now started in academia, you know, of saying what is evidence-based, you know, X, or How do we make sure we have the facts and data? The role of academia is to play that kind of truth teller role and to shape the ideas and practices that people are doing going forward. I mean, Dr. Harper, I'd love to just hear your perspective on research and scholarship and the role that academia can play in terms of equity, of advancing some of these topics through the research and scholarship that they do.
Yeah, I'll be quick on this. I'm thinking about this in 3 ways. I want to applaud the workforce data that you brought here. I think it's really important. A lot of times our data and equity conversation is rightly and understandably focused on student outcomes and student experiences. I get that. I'm not suggesting an either or here, but instead a both and. There's so many inequities in the actual workforce that I don't think are well understood. And again, we're expecting the people who work at a place to help us reach some sort of equitable destination, but yet paradoxically, there are so many inequities between and among them. So I think we need more data there. I also say pretty much every day that we're going nowhere fast on accelerating or actualizing equity without data on climate. Look, I appreciate, traditional measures of student success, first to second year persistence, transfer rates to 4-year institutions, so on and so forth. But what is often missing are data about experiential equity. How people from different racial and ethnic groups are experiencing toxicity in the climate, or erasure in the curriculum, or classrooms that fail to fully honor and appreciate their cultural assets, so on and so forth. Let me just add one more thing here. We have to also be much more mindful in disaggregating quantitative data. We have to be mindful about the erasure of specific Asian subgroups and ethnic groups. A lot of times institutions will very recklessly, make determinations that, AAPI students are just fine. But it isn't until we disaggregate the data by specific ethnic groups that we may find that Vietnamese or Cambodian or Hmong student outcomes are, just as troubling as our outcomes for Black and Latinx students and Indigenous students, right? So I think we have to be, we got to get much better about ensuring that we're not erasing specific student groups.
I would just add a point, excellent points that Shaun is making. There's so much energy now around these issues. I think it's encouraging. Those of us who've been in this space for some time are seeing a litany of really important actors, co-conspirators, of collaborators, of people who are, into this work, because both from a moral and institutional and economic standpoint. And when we have rooms just like this about what we should do, if we had more time, we could fill the walls on what we should do. Equally important to the point of data, what do we stop doing that has been harmful, that has been a decelerant to the equity outcomes? What do we stop doing? As educators, all of us, we have this insufferable disease called more. More, just more. And so I would suggest that one of the most disciplined things that we can do, and we've used Dr. Harper to help us think about, what do we stop doing that's not as impactful? And redirect those resources, that talent, that time, the energy, the heart, to those things that actually do matter and that data suggests actually do work or have the opportunity to work. So I just wanted to add that.
Can I add one more thing? One of the other things from your slides that I want to pick up on in this conversation is the role of higher ed as an idea generator. But one of the challenges of higher ed in terms of being an accelerant for equity is the boundaries and the policing that we've had around which type of knowledge matters. Yes. And so this issue, right, if we're gonna actually accelerate equity, the point you made, Francisco, about hiring, rebuilding, investing in ethnic studies again. Yes. right? The original investment in ethnic studies did not come from goodwill on the part of higher ed, right? It didn't come from a kind of recognition that, hey, there's this gap in our knowledge. It was student protest uprising nationwide, right, that said, hey, we want to learn and see ourselves. Well, we did it in the curriculum, but we didn't fully do it in the faculty. We never carried it through. And we still are struggling with the boundaries of disciplines that are saying, we want you, faculty of color in the academy, but this is the box. Don't stray outside of that line. And for us to really accelerate equity, we actually have to question the knowledge itself and create space for that knowledge.
Look, I don't want to be rude, but a thing that's sort of kind of on trend right now, particularly here in California, is having an ethnic studies requirement for every student. I am not at all opposed to that, but it makes me wonder who's going to teach all these courses. It just makes me wonder that, right? And will we continue, in fact, to see even there in the teaching of ethnic studies a demographic mismatch between the students who are being taught and the people teaching them?
So can I build on that? Because it's not just the mismatch, but it's the service obligation. So even if we get a match, it's a service obligation as opposed to a scholarly pursuit. So we're hiring you because the thing that we care about is what happens for our students, but that connecting back to the idea generation, the scholarship, the questions that you ask, the knowledge that you produce. So even if we hire you, here's the box.
Right.
Exactly right. Dr. Branch talked about the system is creating precisely the outcomes it was designed to produce. So this reimagination, this retrofit, this reinterpretation, I think is super significant. It's also on the discussion of ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is its own canon, own traditions. It's not a chapter or two as part of a larger discipline of sociology or history or even women's studies. It has its own traditions, its own academic canon, and it needs to be legitimized. And it's been marginalized in the academy for 50 years. And I would say, to end on this piece, our students are uprising now. It's a different way, but they're uprising now. They're clamoring for more relevant curriculum, for faculty members who look like the folks who are up here, that match the demographics of the students that we're serving. It's educationally purposeful to all students to have a racialized faculty amongst it, to be race conscious about our hiring, our policies, our practices, our resource allocations, because it can make the most impact, to supplant the things that we know have not worked over time. So I would just sort of, in these conversations, ultimately a budget, whether it be a departmental budget, a division budget, a university, a community college budget, is a reflection of our values and our priorities. What I think you used the word, Dr. Branch, investment. What are we investing in that makes a difference in the lives of students and ultimately to the communities that we're so proud to serve?
If I could, because you just got us going. If we said it in one sentence, the wrap up to the conversation we've been having is, will higher ed require you to shed who you are to thrive? Or will we reimagine ourselves to embrace who you are?
Bring your whole self.
That's the question. And that's the accelerant, right? When we do that, when we structure our systems, our support, our curriculum, everything, and as you are, that's the thing.
Yeah, let me jump back in too.
Last one, and then
And it's the question of what should we stop doing? We should stop doing this haphazardly and piecemeal. A real accelerant is strategy. Too few institutions have cohesive strategies for actualizing racial equity.
And couple that strategy with cultural change, institutional climate change.
Completely.
Those things together matter.
Completely. No, I mean, I think this is right. If you apply this thinking to, some of my private sector clients, when they want to go after something, they have a strategy for it. Oftentimes, higher education institutions will have a strategy for growth. They'll have a strategy for decreasing expenses. They have a strategy for excellence and preeminence, many of which, we serve. But then we ask what the strategy around equity is, then it's like, well, talk to this person who's 4 or 5 levels down, right? And so I think the strategy point is critical, not just to make sure you make progress, but so that that progress is sustained. So I'll end with this question, and then if we have time, we can open it up for a question or two from the audience. We've talked about the past. We've talked about higher education as educators. We've talked about the idea generation piece. There's also this piece around community institutions. If we look at our communities nationally, but also locally, stark income inequality, significant challenges based on the COVID-19 pandemic, existential threats when it comes to climate change. So all of these things are happening in our communities, and all of these things have equity implications. So there's a question, which is, how do we think about higher education, not just in its role of educating and producing new knowledge, but its role of being a community institution? Dr. Branch, one of the things you do at Rutgers is lead not just diversity, equity, inclusion, but also community. So I would love just to hear how you're thinking about it, and also advice you can give the folks out there around how to think around higher education institutions as community institutions as an accelerant to equity. Absolutely.
And my reflections are not because we've done it, right? But because we're in process. And I think the most important, one of the challenges, I'll start with the challenges and then why we move and why we need to accelerate. One of the challenges for higher education, particularly the R1 sector, is the thing that we value and measure ourselves against is not community engagement. It's not even on the list, right? So it's funding, it's faculty, it's publications, it's student outcomes, it's acceptance rates. But it is not meaningful engagement with your community. And so this question of what we value and what we invest in and the ways that we compete with each other is one of the foundational questions. And the promise of higher education, the accelerant potential, is if we own as our primary objective our relationship to the communities that sit around us, the students who can see us out their window but can never step foot on our campus, right? That what is our role? And embracing that as important and as meaningful, so that we don't just go to the neighborhood high school to cream off the top, right? But to think about what does that mean, and that we don't only do it in ways that are self-serving. Because yes, we want to build our diverse incoming class, but beyond that, what are we doing? These are questions that most higher ed institutions I'm talking about the R1 sector because this is in the DNA of community colleges, right? And so this idea of what it means for the sector to actually build meaningful relationships. If you want to disturb any president, any admissions officer, just talk about the demographic cliff. And it's like suddenly we've discovered urban communities, right? Oh yeah, but that's still in this kind of self-serving versus what does it mean for there to be meaningful partnership and engagement? That's not just about the outcome I need, but building rich, supportive communities that surround us. And higher ed has amazing transformative potential to be engines of mobility for their communities. And we can do it accidentally, or we can do it strategically, and that's the question.
Yeah, let me build on this quickly. Here is a novel idea. Perhaps we should ask people in our communities how we can better serve them, as opposed to presuming that we know and presuming that what we have determined is community engagement is in fact meaningful to the people. No, you got to talk to the people. You have to ask the people, how can this institution be a better neighbor, a better servant, a better accelerant of equity in our community, right? Way too often, the deciders are not the folks in community. Let me connect this to the demographics that you shared, right? It's mostly white folks who lead institutions. I mean, that's just a matter of fact. It's in the data, right? So it's mostly white people who are making determinations about what's good for communities of color. And oftentimes they get really proud of themselves. Look at our extensive catalog of community engagement things. And the black and brown people are like, yeah, no, that's not helpful to us. It's not what we need. It's not what we asked for because nobody's asked us what would be useful to us.
Or even when you do it from the best of intentions.
Best of intentions.
That it exists for a year and then the grant ends and
Right.
So the thing that you asked us, you built it.
Right.
But you actually had no intentionality around what does the community need in an ongoing way? And how do we build that? And as higher ed is struggling with budgets and deficits and challenges, the first thing to go are these extraneous relationships that are not mission central, right? Everyone's heard that language. And so the question is, will we change that language and reorient our priorities?
And it leads to mistrust. Eventually, right, like folks in communities begin to further mistrust institutions to be reliable partners.
Yes. And I would add, maybe this is an obvious point, being in Los Angeles, being a Chicano, being bilingual, bicultural, and biliterate in this particular space. It makes a difference when I show up to a community organization, to a high school, to a parent group, to a college. It makes a difference, a palpable difference. I bring my whole self into that leadership environment. It's not uncommon that the highest number of women, BIPOC, folks of color, folks who are disabled, folks who are veterans, they most show up as college presidents at the two-year system, where indeed we accept the top 100% of the graduating class. We're very selective, 100%. So those reasons, the fact that so many of us came from low-income environments, first generation, other than English speaking, from mixed status homes, from parents or family members who have disabilities. All that for us is value added. It helps to shape and inform our leadership lens as to where those investments go. We are those students, little older versions, but those lived experiences where before were seen as deficits, things that could put you on the sidelines, are now actually assets to both the leadership quotient and ultimately to the resource allocation as to where you are investing. Your budget is a reflection of your values and your priorities.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that a version of what you just described also happens at historically black colleges and universities. As a proud alum of one of them, Albany State, I'm thinking about this question, right, of how can higher education accelerate equity? HBCUs for years have been overproducing relative to black student enrollments in their undergraduate student body, overproducing folks who go on to pursue MDs and PhDs and other graduate degrees and who ascend to positions of leadership across all of the professions. We probably ought to study more the cultural practices, curricular practices, practices of affirmation and so on that happen at historically black colleges and universities and scale that and replicate that in other places.
As well as the ethic of care.
The ethic of care for sure.
It's a fascinating place to end because we have a report coming out on racial equity, but we just released a report on HBCUs to that effect. If you think about what higher education has the potential to do, HBCUs are a really good example. Educating students, not just in their full selves, but also through the curriculum, a faculty that's representative, significant research and scholarship, not just in general, but also on disparities across different topics, and then prominent community institutions, critical institutions, anchor institutions in their community. And so if you're interested in topics of economic mobility, particularly black economic mobility, HBCUs are a great place to start. And to that point, if you're interested in how higher education can accelerate equity, HBCUs I think are a great example. So we've run out of time, so I can't open up for questions, but we'll be around after. Thank you all for, I think, a phenomenal and rich conversation. Appreciate it.